Hello, guys. It's Mr. Connor. I hope you're having a nice Wednesday so far. Hopefully, things are going well for you. Hopefully, you're still able to access all the stuff you need for school. And again, if you're ever having a problem with that, we would be happy to let you know what to do through email. So just email your teachers. That's, again, your best bet if you're having any trouble accessing stuff for school. Or if you want help on your paper, just attach it, email it to me, and I'll look at it and drop you some comments. Hopefully my audio's good. This is the first time I've live streamed on YouTube before, so I might check the chat here. See, can you guys hear me? I feel like the Verizon wireless guy. Can you hear me now? So jump over to the chat here and check the audio. Are we good? Sweet, thanks guys. Anyways, we're gonna jump right into it then if the audio's fine. Mrs. Davis again is sending us daily prayers, so that's awesome of her, and I encourage you guys to look at these. We're gonna go on and pray this bad boy out. So, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Again, it's awesome Miss Davis sending us stuff like that, so that's always nice. Jumping over to classroom here, we've got a couple things for you today, but again, since your paper is going to be due next Wednesday, 1 week from today, that's mostly what you'll be working on. Here's the notes. We'll get into these here. These are continuing where we left off, talking about France occupying, colonizing what they called Indochina, which included Vietnam, where we would later end up in a war. So there was a push for Vietnamese independence throughout the entire time that France was there. The Vietnamese wanted to kick the French out and rule themselves. During World War II, Japan would actually come in and occupy Vietnam as well as the rest of Indochina. And when the war was over, the Japanese had lost because we nuked them. The Japanese surrendered control back to the French after World War II. The Vietnamese aren't really happy to see the French come back in, and particularly Ho Chi Minh and his communist Viet Minh are going to immediately start fighting the French for independence. So right after the end of World War II, the French are going to be fighting in Vietnam against Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces. Now, the communist forces here are going to be propped up by communist China. It's going to pump billions of dollars worth of war materials, guns, things like that, planes, everything you'd need to fight a war. So communist China's pumping a lot in to help the Viet Minh fight the French. The Viet Minh have a political stronghold in North Vietnam. That's where they were, most powerful, was in northern Vietnam. You might also know that's the part of Vietnam that's right next to China. So that would make sense that would be where they'd have their foothold. The United States, on the other hand, would pledge to help the French side. We'd send $15 million in aid and $1 billion worth of just equipment, war material, etc. to fight the communist Viet Minh. That was, again, because Truman believed in domino theory, Eisenhower believed in domino theory, John F. Kennedy believed in domino theory, and Lyndon B. Johnson all believed in domino theory, that if we let Vietnam fall to communism, then all the countries around Vietnam will then fall to communism, just like dominoes tipping over. So we desperately wanted to keep the French in charge here to prevent communists from taking over Vietnam. Here's some pictures for you. Here's French soldiers with a captured Viet Minh soldier here. You can see this soldier's extremely young. That's because, again, the Viet Minh was a group of everyday civilians that they basically just said, here's a gun, go fight the French. So this kid looks like he'd probably be in high school. So, these French soldiers are obviously, they look like what you think of when you think of a soldier. When most of us think of a soldier, we don't think of, kids, women, and in some cases even children. This kid, he looks like, an adolescent, probably a teenager. But, the Viet Minh would occasionally include children younger than that. Seen here is Ho Chi Minh, the communist mastermind behind putting this whole communist revolution together in French Indochina. The general seen here is Vo Nguyen Giap. So he's going to be the main general for the Viet Minh. And this guy, they called him the Red Napoleon because he was just an extremely cutting-edge general. He worked with what he had, which was, again, occasionally women and children. He worked with what he had. And he was kind of the king of sneak attacks, surprise attacks, attacking at night, the hit-and-run tactics that we would later, the United States would struggle with quite a bit in the Vietnam War. So this guy knew, he wouldn't be able to stand and fight the French and then later the Americans head on. They'd have to use some sort of sneaky tactics to gain the advantage. Seen here are some Viet Minh soldiers. They're marching on, looks like a railroad bridge here. That's what that looks like. So the United States is initially involved mostly as a financier, as in we're going to throw a bunch of money towards the French side and hope that they prevail. Well, the French start losing, and we would then start sending more money. And then eventually advisors and pilots and people who could help train the French soldiers to fight these communists. So we initially started with money. Then it turned to, war material. Then it turned to advisors. And then finally, some pilots and some soldiers to help train the French. So here's a picture of Vietnam again. The Viet Minh would be most powerful up here in North Vietnam because China was just pumping guns across the border for them to use. This is also where the capital of Vietnam, Hanoi, is located up here. The first American to die in Vietnam, this is like an insane story, absolutely put this on your Wikipedia reading list, is Richard Fitzgibbon. In 1956, he was on a training flight mission where one of the officers in his crew made a mistake. He, being the commanding officer, reprimanded the guy and said, "You screwed up." Well, that guy didn't take that criticism too lightly, and later in the day shot Fitzgibbons, and then himself jumped out of a building and died. It's an insane story. You need to look this up. It's insane. Richard Fitzgibbon. So he's the first American soldier to die in Vietnam, and strangely enough, his son would later sign up to fight in the Vietnam War in the 60s, the one where the Americans are much more involved, and his son dies in I wrote it down in here, in 1965. So that's a father and son combo that both died in Vietnam fighting communists, but the father wasn't killed by a communist or Viet Minh or anything like that. He was actually killed by one of the soldiers that reported to him. It's just an insane story. So it's very sad that, that from that family's perspective, that a father and a son would both die in some foreign jungle, halfway across the world. It's pretty depressing. The Viet Minh are going to continue beating up on the French. The French really, really struggle with how much forested areas and how much jungle there is in Vietnam. Makes it incredibly hard to fight regular battles. So despite the aid, the advisors, the weapons, and the money we send the French, they're defeated by the Viet Minh in 1954. Eisenhower was worried over this because he knew, if France falls and loses Vietnam to communism, then the countries around Vietnam, like Laos and Cambodia, they might then become communists as well, as in the dominoes would keep falling. So peace is negotiated. The U.S. is going to be involved in this, and we actually negotiate to create a whole new country, South Vietnam, which is going to be a democracy. So we get involved in this Geneva Accords conference and create a whole new country that's going to be a democracy. That would kind of be similar to how there's a North Korea that's communist and a South Korea that's a democracy that we're friends with. North Korea, obviously we're not friends with them. Ho Chi Minh will get his wish, and that's to be formally recognized as the leader of a communist North Vietnam. So in his eyes, the war was successful, that he got his communist nation and the rest of the world was forced to recognize him as the communist dictator of this North Vietnam. So the Viet Minh were a very elusive enemy, and that's something the United States would struggle with a lot later in the war, is that it's very hard to fight, the unknown enemy. An army made up of everyday citizens, women, children. You don't know who the good guys and the bad guys are, and that's actually something with the war in Afghanistan we still have problems with. It's very hard to fight an enemy who doesn't wear, a military uniform. They're just an everyday person who, maybe secretly holstering a gun and then decide, to open fire on you. It's an extremely hard enemy to wage a war against. Here's how the map would work out with the Geneva Accord. In 1954, the French lose, and 4 countries are established. 2 of them would be communist. North Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh, and Cambodia with Pol Pot, who we'll talk about later. Laos would later become communist in the 1970s, kind of proving that domino theory was a real concern. So Laos later becomes communist, but initially in 1954 wasn't. This democracy here, South Vietnam, we would pledge to protect them. We step in and say, hey, we're going to keep you protected from communist North Vietnam, much like we do with South Korea. So this line here is kind of like the line between North and South Korea. Don't cross this or America's going to come over and kick some butt. And that is eventually what happens. But unfortunately, we don't really kick a whole lot of butt in this war. So eventually, South Vietnam, we would lose this war. Well, spoiler alert for you. We do lose the Vietnam War, and South Vietnam does fall to communism eventually. And that's why Vietnam today is a unified country, and it's communist. So that would tell you we lose this war, South Vietnam loses the Vietnam War. And that's how it's going to work out eventually. The battle at Dien Bien Phu, which was mentioned in the assignment yesterday and in that video, the Viet Minh completely trapped the French. They are totally screwed over, like 10,000, I think it's 11,000 or 12,000, something like in that range. So like 12,000 French soldiers are captured. That's not good. Dien Bien Phu, we're going to take a look at this on Google Maps, and you'd see why the French would have such a hard time fighting the Viet Minh, because it's very densely forested. So they were trapped in, surrounded by the jungle, and bullets were just coming from everywhere out of the jungle. They couldn't see their enemy, which again is it's very hard to fight an enemy when you can't see them. Last slide here. Ho Chi Minh obviously is going to have to rely on his communist neighbor to the north, Mao Zedong, and communist China. They're going to pump a lot of weapons and money to his side, and that makes it pretty well inevitable that he would defeat the French, and then later, his side's going to defeat the Americans as well. Khrushchev, the Soviet Union's dictator, is also communist. He's going to pump some money over for Ho Chi Minh, some weapons, some MiG aircraft, and AK-47s, which we'll talk about later in this unit. The AK-47, a gun that just won't jam. So the Soviets are going to throw, tons of guns over to the Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, so that they can then use these guns to fight France and then later fight the United States and South Vietnam. So there's the notes for today. If we go back over to Classroom, it says, go to Google Earth and just street view random places in the Vietnamese countryside. It's going to give you a feel for how difficult this war was for the French, and then later why it was problematic for the United States. So here we are. Let's get a little street view action here. I'm going to have to zoom this out because the angle's all weird. Might check the chat here. Alright, looks like you guys can still hear me. Everything's going fine. Anyways, here's, let's go up to Dien Bien Phu. You can see what it was like. Here's Dien Bien Phu. Alright, let's pop into a street view out here in the countryside at Dien Bien Phu, where the French would be absolutely destroyed. So this is what we're looking at. You know, there is a regular city over here, but even the city is pretty densely forested. The Vietnamese would just be popping out of the jungle here from every direction. The French were completely surrounded, and you can imagine just, you know, bullets raining down from you. And you look at this jungle here, and you couldn't see your enemy. They were mortaring, you know, shooting mortars over, and you had no idea what their position was, and you couldn't mortar them back. So you can see it's extremely densely forested out here, and that's going to be problematic for the French, and then later for the Americans. Now there are open areas in the countryside in Vietnam, notably where there are like rice paddies and agriculture. But let's do another. Let's pick another random place out in the countryside, so you can get a feel for the terrain here. Okay, this is just straight up in the woods somewhere. Looks like some marker for Dien Bien Phu. It's dated 1954. This must be commemorating the Vietnamese victory, the Viet Ming's victory here. So, a war monument. Accidentally stumbled onto that. Let's pop into another location. Let's go further away from the mountains here. Let's get down towards more central Vietnam here. Alright, let's just pick a random place. Alright, again, you know, there's some open areas here, but pretty mountainous, lots of jungles. I don't know if those would actually qualify as mountains. They're more hills than they are mountains. But you can imagine, you know, if there's just bullets coming out of the woods at you, that would be you know, a difficult situation. Let's do one more random street view, then we'll be done with it. I'm hoping one of these will pop out in like a rice paddy. See if I can try and pick one that looks like it'd be a rice paddy. How about this one right here? This looks like agricultural land. Here you go. So yeah, this is agricultural land. So there are some open spaces, you know. This would be, you could fight a battle. You could fight a pitched battle here. Not a lot of places to hide. And so this is a place where you probably wouldn't find any Viet Minh. They wouldn't want to take you head on here out in the open. They'd want to be back in the jungle somewhere, hiding from you, and they'd wait until nightfall, then come do a hit and run attack. So again, that was the strategy of the Viet Minh, was guerrilla warfare. They wouldn't come and fight you in the middle of the day out here in this rice paddy. Cool. So yeah, I'd encourage you to go into Google Earth, look around in Vietnam. It's a really pretty country, but yeah, very densely forested. A lot of jungle. Your next step for today would be to work on your essay. It's due next Wednesday. You can always just email me if you need help, but I'd encourage you to, you know, attach your paper so that I could take a look at your essay more specifically. So if you need help, just send it over. I'll gladly look at it for you, give you some advice, and let you know, if you're stuck where I think you should go, or if you're like, I'm not going to get to 3 pages, I need more info, stuff that I'd say you could include in your paper. So it's a 3 to 5 page paper. You can get to 3 pages, and if you feel like you're good, then you're good. You don't have to try and pump this one up and get all the way to 5 pages. It's 3 to 5 pages is the range. If you're in that range, you're good. So that's really it for today. And hop over here to the chat, see if anybody's got any questions. Looks like Nolan says his grandpa was in Vietnam. Well, he would be a person you could ask all about this unit. He was there, he lived it, and yeah, he could probably tell you all about how difficult it was to fight in Vietnam because of just how densely forested it was. He worked on planes. That's what my grandpa did in World War II. He was a part of a bomb squadron. He worked the radio. Cool. Looks like it says there's 21 people watching. Those are good numbers. I guess that's really it for today then. So have a good rest of your Wednesday. If you got questions, email me. Peace.